Poetry has been extremely relevant to language and culture for longer than we can imagine. Some of the earliest texts we have are poetic. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest text that we know of, is about 40 centuries old, or the poem of Beowulf written in Old English, which inspired The Lord of the Rings. Historically, through poetry, oral and written, people have told stories and expressed their thoughts and feelings in an artistic way. It is more than clear that poetry is a universal form of expression. And the way we access poetry is through language. Now, the science that studies language at its various levels and structures is linguistics. So it is clear why poetry should be a topic of interest for linguists from many viewpoints. But I want to touch on something more particular. Maybe you have read a poem that amazed you with its wordplay, or have cried to the lyrics of a song, or there's been a quote from a film or a speech that just hit you too hard with the feels.
All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
The connection to that poetic language is your aesthetic appreciation and your personal interpretation. In other words, the reasons that lead you to react deeply to the art behind the words. So I wanted to find out if linguistics had any answer for how this works. And I found 4 ways that approach the interpretation of poetic language: selectional restriction violation, systemic functional linguistics, linguistic relativism, and critical stylistics. In syntax, there is something called selectional restriction, which refers to how verbs only make sense when paired with certain subjects and objects. For example, the moon wanes, the rabbit eats carrots, you think a lot. Now, all of these examples make sense literally, but we could also defy this scheme, like the moon thinks a lot, the carrots eat you, or the rabbit wanes. This is what is known as the selectional restriction violation, or SRV. We have used these modifiers with the verb in a way that doesn't make literal sense. But we don't speak literally all the time in our lives. Selectional restriction violation is also present in everyday speech, like when we say that a memory is blurry, or we feel blue, or we wrap our heads around something. You might already see where this is going to, because selectional restriction violation is pretty similar to what in literature we call a metaphor, which is when these kinds of non-literal language are used to convey a deeper meaning. And metaphors are widely used in poetry as a rhetorical device. In linguistics, we have an exceedingly famous example that serves this purpose. In 1957, the great linguist Noam Chomsky said, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." And he came up with this sentence in order to show us that our grammar doesn't make literal sense all the time. It's not based on literal sense. Instead, it is a system from which you can come up with new language, even if it doesn't make sense. Now, related to the selectional restriction violation, Chomsky believed that sentences that break the rules can often be explained through metaphor. That is, that whenever we find sentences that don't seem logical or literal in its sense, we can think about them metaphorically to better understand them. Next one, systemic functional linguistics, which was developed by these other incredible linguists, Michael Halliday and Ruqayya Hassan. Their aim with SFL was not related to poetry, but Hassan later proposed that analyzing poetry with SFL was adequate. So, systemic functional linguistics is based on the idea of language as a system with various strata. Hassan conceived poetry as having 2 levels of meaning, one linguistic and one artistic, and each formed its own system. According to Hassan, there is a way in which the semiotic system of language, which has the strata of phonology, lexicogrammar, and semantics, is related to the system of verbal arts, in which poetry is included, and whose strata, as Hassan defined them, are verbalization, symbolic articulation, and theme. Now, these two systems are interconnected by one element, verbalization, which is where language starts becoming a verbal art. Some researchers also add a fourth stratum, very much relevant to both the language and the poetry, which is contexts. Now, for systemic functional linguists, this means that you can analyze and compare poetry starting from the most basic elements of language and gradually working up your way to the theme. And we move to our third topic, linguistic relativism, which was proposed by two linguists in the 40s called Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Wolfe, though out of the two, Wolfe remains the most well known. But you might know this duo's album by another name, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which claims that the language you speak essentially defines the way you think. Whorf studied the indigenous languages of America and found that many of these languages did not have a way to say things that for Americans and Europeans were universal. They had other ways of thinking. So they proposed that the languages were responsible for defining how these people thought. The idea that your language and your worldview were related preceded Whorf's linguistic relativism too. In the early 20th century, a French philosopher called Lucien Levy-Bruhl also studied the indigenous languages of America, as well as some others from places like Australia and Tasmania. And he also thought that there ought to be a relationship between the languages and their worldview. Now, Levy-Bruhl was really ethnocentrist, and like many others of the time, he thought that European society and languages were civilized and logical, whereas non-European ones were savage and pre-logical. And he attributed these differences in languages to the cognitive differences of the populations. So nice of you, Lucien. What does this have to do with poetry? Well, it was Levy-Bruhl's linguistic relativism that influenced a very important modernist poet of the time, Ezra Pound. Pound thought, like Levy-Bruhl, that the differences in languages were caused by differences in ways of thinking. He believed as a poet that poets were essential to inheriting and renewing the language. He was also influenced by another figure called Ernest Fenollosa, which spoke about how Chinese had other and somewhat better ways to engage in poetry than English. And so Pound thought that there was poetic value to be found in the verbs of other languages, and that English's verbs were too limited, or that while European languages expressed things in matters of categories and classes, other languages had words which were more precise or concrete. He also thought that these differences not only existed between languages at the time, but also throughout ages. He worried about languages that were almost incomprehensible to the poets of the era, wondering about the kinds of feelings and thoughts that the poets of centuries ago were able to convey through their language, and which is now lost through time. He thought that these ancient languages left a lacuna in the minds of the speakers as they evolved and disappeared. He also thought, against the belief of the time that learning languages makes you dumb, that learning other languages was a way to break out from your worldview and open yourself to other ways of thinking. By the way, Pound was a fascist and he supported Hitler and Mussolini when they rose to power, just in case you wanted to say in public that he's your hero. I wish he just had opened himself to other worldviews. But the kind of linguistic relativism by Pound is very attractive to poets. It's a poetic relativism. It's especially attentive to how poetry carries unique artistic value in each language. Lastly, critical stylistics. Style refers to how writers make a linguistic choice in order to convey whatever they want artistically. Stylistics, then, is the study of how these linguistic choices are related to language aesthetics. And critical stylistics merges stylistics with an approach in linguistics called critical discourse analysis, which aims to analyze how written and oral texts reflect the ideologies of those that produce them. So critical stylistics, then, studies how linguistic choices in the text can make the ideologies and intentions of the author more evident. Critical stylistics was proposed by Leslie Jeffries in 2010. It comprises a series of procedures in order to analyze and notice how the author might think certain concepts are related, what information is more important to them, what we can infer from the writing, and even what the text is designed to make us imagine. Despite critical stylistics being more apt for prose, it can also have a use in analyzing poetry, like finding out the relationships between certain words used by the author or the messages they may imply.